The conference hall of the Del Valle Collegium's exobiology faculty had been empty for 3 hours when Dr. Osavith Kren returned to her bench and opened the file again. She had not meant to return. She had left at the scheduled end of the day's observation session, walked the length of the eastern corridor to her faculty office, set her datapad on the charging cradle, removed her observation glasses, and sat in the dark for 11 minutes before standing up and walking back. The corridor was empty. The overhead panels had shifted to their night cycle luminance, a muted blue-white that cast long, soft shadows across the polished stone floor, and her footsteps echoed in a way they did not during working hours, when the building was full of researchers and students, and the particular ambient noise of a large academic institution doing its daily work. She was a xenobiologist, 1,200 published papers, 4 species classification reviews accepted by the Intersystem Taxonomy Board, a tenured seat on the faculty of exobiology that she had held for 31 years, since before most of her current research assistants had been born. She had cataloged pain responses across 94 sentient species and authored the Collegium's standard reference text on comparative nociception, the 5-volume Kren series that every exobiology student in the compact read during their second year of study. She understood, with a depth of knowledge that few living scholars could match, how biological organisms process damage. She did not understand what she had watched today. The file that had brought her to this moment sat open on her datapad, its header stamped with classification codes she had never seen applied to a biological subject. The file was titled, Intersystem Compact, Office of Xenobiological Risk Assessment. Subject Classification Review, Human Terran, File Designation HS 4481. Requested by Regional Governor Talith Vorn. Reason for review, anomalous physiological response observed during medical intervention. Priority, immediate. The file had arrived at the Collegium 14 days ago. Kren had been the 3rd scholar to receive it. The first 2 had returned it within hours, one citing a scheduling conflict, the other citing personal reasons that she did not elaborate on. Kren had read both refusal memos and found them professionally adequate and personally unconvincing. Scholars at the Del Valle Collegium did not refuse classification reviews. The reviews were the Collegium's primary function, the reason the compact funded its existence. Refusing one was not career-ending, but it was noticed. Both scholars had accepted the notice without protest. Kren had opened the file, read the incident summary, and accepted the review within the hour. She had not understood at the time why anyone would refuse it. Now, sitting in the observation gallery of the Applied Research Theater, a tiered amphitheater of polished basalt and frosted glass built into the southern face of the campus tower, designed for the live study of biological specimens under controlled conditions, she understood completely. The human was in the theater below her, or he had been until an hour ago when the day's final session ended and he was escorted to his quarters in the residential wing. The space he had occupied the diagnostic platform at the theater's center, surrounded by sensor arrays and telemetric monitoring equipment, and the curved transparent partitions that separated the subject from the observation tier, was empty now. The instruments were in standby. The thermal plate set into the platform's surface was dark and cool. The air circulators hummed their constant low note, cycling atmosphere through filters designed to capture any biological particulate a specimen might shed. Kren stared at the empty platform and tried, for the 4th time that evening, to begin her research log entry for the day. Her stylus hovered above the datapad. The cursor blinked. She could not find the opening words, which was a new experience for a woman who had written 1,200 papers, and who had, on more than one occasion, been praised by the Taxonomy Board for the precision and clarity of her scientific prose. The words were there. She knew what the data showed. She simply did not want to write it down, because Writing it down would make it a finding, and findings had to be reported, and the report she would eventually have to file was going to change the way the compact classified an entire species. And she was no longer certain the compact's classification system had a category for what she had found. The file's incident report described events at the Tertiary Reach Colonial Medical Center 6 weeks prior. A structural foreman named Gage Maddox, 47 standard years old, had been recovered from the wreckage of a cargo transfer platform following a catastrophic decompression event. The platform's primary airlock had failed, while Maddox was conducting an exterior hull inspection, exposing him to hard vacuum for approximately 90 seconds before the emergency containment system repressurized the section. 90 seconds of unprotected vacuum exposure. The survivable threshold in the compact's medical literature ranged from 8 to 40 seconds depending on species, with death from embolism, hypoxia, or both occurring within 60. Maddox had been conscious for the first 50. He had used that time to locate the emergency seal panel, enter the manual override code from memory, a 9-digit alphanumeric sequence that the facility's safety officer later confirmed he had recited without a single error, and initiate repressurization before losing consciousness. The attending physician's report noted extensive soft tissue damage, pulmonary hemorrhaging, dermal capillary rupture across 40% of his body surface, and temporary bilateral hearing loss from tympanic membrane trauma. Maddox had regained consciousness 11 minutes after repressurization. His first coherent statement, per the medical bay's audio log: "Did the seal hold?" The seal had held. He had entered the code correctly, in hard vacuum. While his blood vessels ruptured and his lungs hemorrhaged, and his eardrums tore, and his exposed skin sublimated moisture into the void. That was not the reason Kren was here. That was merely the context, the event that had delivered a human patient to an alien medical facility, and set in motion the sequence of observations that would end with her sitting in an empty gallery, unable to begin a log entry she had written 1,200 versions of before. The reason was what happened during his surgical recovery. The vacuum exposure had caused, among other injuries, a deep laceration to Maddox's left forearm where a hull plating fragment had struck him during decompression. 12 centimeters long, 4 deep, 2 severed tendons, and a partial transection of the radial artery. The facility's surgical team, 3 Delvari physicians and 1 Tertiary anesthesiologist, had prepared to repair the damage under general anesthesia. The anesthesiologist administered the standard sedation protocol, a calculated dose of soporific 7, a neurosuppressive compound that induced unconsciousness by interrupting thalamic relay signals to the cortex. It was the compact's most widely used general anesthetic. It had been in clinical use for over 2 centuries. It worked on every species in the biological registry without documented exception. The dose calculation for Maddox's body mass indicated a therapeutic window of 40 minutes, more than sufficient for the tendon repair. 12 minutes into the procedure, the human opened his eyes. The lead surgeon, Dr. Peleth Vaughn, a Delvari with 22 years of surgical experience, was focused on the tendon repair under magnification with microsurgical instruments. The assisting surgeon was managing the hemostatic field. The circulating nurse monitored the instrument array. The anesthesiologist was reviewing the biotelemetry feed when the neural activity monitor began registering patterns that were not consistent with an unconscious brain. By the time she looked up, Maddox was watching the surgery. Not thrashing, not screaming, not seizing. He was lying on the surgical table with his head turned slightly left, looking at the open wound in his own forearm. And his expression, the anesthesiologist's incident report described it as attentive curiosity, was the face of a person watching something moderately interesting happen to someone else. She administered a supplemental dose, Maddox blinked. His eyes stayed open. Heart rate held at 69 beats per minute. A second supplemental dose. Cumulative soporific 7 now sufficient to render a tertiary, a species twice his body mass, with a metabolic rate calibrated for high-gravity environments unconscious for 6 hours. His eyelids drooped briefly. Neural monitor showed a cortical dip. Then the readings climbed back to full wakefulness, and Maddox said, without looking away from the wound, "That one almost worked." The surgical team stopped operating. Dr. Von later described the moment as the only time in my career I have set my instruments down because I did not trust myself to continue. Not because the patient was in danger, because the patient was awake, watching his own tendons being reattached, commenting on the anesthetic's efficacy, and the distance between what was happening and what Von's training said should be possible had made his hands unsteady. Maddox looked up and saw the team frozen around him. 4 alien physicians, masked and gowned, instruments suspended mid-motion, staring at him. A 2-second pause on the telemetry, heart rate dipping by a single beat. The micro-expression, the facial analysis software, tagged as recognition of social error. And then he spoke the words that Kren had underlined twice in her research log before this evening session had properly begun. "Please stop helping it, you're making it worse." He was not referring to the surgery. Dr. Von's addendum clarified. The human meant the anesthetic. The supplemental doses were making him feel foggy and slow, and the fogginess was more distressing to him than the sensation of the surgery itself. He requested that the team continue without further sedation or allow him to remain fully conscious, because, direct quote, audio log, same flat conversational tone he had used throughout, "I can feel what you're doing, but it's not that bad. I've had worse from a table saw." A table saw. Kren had looked up the term. A human carpentry tool, a spinning metal blade used to cut wood. The human was comparing open surgical repair of severed tendons and a partially transected artery to a workshop injury sustained while building furniture. The team completed the procedure with Maddox fully conscious. Heart rate during the remainder, 66 to 71. Cortisol elevated only to levels the Compact's database associated with moderate exercise. Pain was present by every measurable indicator. Nociceptive signals firing at full fidelity. Peripheral nervous system transmitting damage reports to the brain without interruption. The brain received them, acknowledged them, filed them as non-priority information, directed conscious attention elsewhere. At one point during the tendon reattachment, Maddox asked Dr. Von how the microsurgical instruments worked. Von had answered, mostly because the alternative was to stand in silence and confront the fact that his patient was conducting a casual technical interview while having his arm surgically reconstructed without anesthesia. That was the incident Regional Governor Vorn had flagged. That was the file 2 scholars had refused. And now, 14 days into a classification review that had quietly become the most disturbing research project of her career, Kren sat in an empty gallery at night cycle, reading her own notes, unable to reconcile what she had documented with what she had believed about the universal architecture of biological pain for 31 years. She had designed the review protocol herself, a series of controlled stimuli administered under full biotelemetric monitoring, with the subject's informed consent and cooperation. Maddox had been cooperative from the first hour. He had signed the consent forms, answered the intake questionnaire with the same flat patience the incident report described, and asked only 2 questions: whether the Collegium's cafeteria was any good, because the food at the Colonial Medical Center had been pretty rough, and whether he could send a message to his construction crew's foreman to let them know he was fine and expected to return to work whenever the science people are done. Whenever the science people are done. As if this were a workplace physical. As if the most advanced biological research institution in the Compact were a minor administrative detour in his schedule. The first 3 days of the protocol had been documentation, baseline physiological scans, cognitive assessments, genetic sampling. Standard classification review procedure. The data confirmed what the incident report had suggested. Maddox was a normal human, not enhanced, not augmented, not genetically modified. His medical history showed the standard human vaccination schedule: 2 prior fractures, one at age 19, one at age 34, both healed without complication, a mild allergy to a pterin plant compound called ragweed, and a notation that he preferred to sleep on his right side. There was nothing in his biology that explained the surgical incident, nothing in his genetics that distinguished him from any other human in the Compact's database. Which meant the trait was not specific to Maddox, it was baseline. Whatever the controlled trials revealed about his pain processing would be, by reasonable extrapolation, true of every member of his species. That realization had settled into Kren's awareness on day 1, and had not left since. She had not been alone in the observation gallery during the controlled trials. Sathkavetha, a Teshari neurobiologist who specialized in comparative pain processing, had joined the review team on day 2. He was large even by Teshari standards, broad through the thorax, dense-boned, his optical membrane set deep beneath a heavy brow ridge that gave his face a quality of perpetual, unhurried contemplation. He moved slowly and spoke quietly, the way very large animals sometimes did when they had nothing left to prove to anyone in the room. He had published extensively on nociceptive architecture across multiple phyla, and had been, before this assignment, the Compact's foremost academic authority on pain system limits in carbon-based organisms. 2 assistant researchers rounded out the team: Delvari postdoctoral fellows named Yeth Oruna and Talais Ven, both competent, both methodical, both visibly less composed at the end of day 12 than they had been at the beginning of day 1. Neither had spoken about the reason. They did not need to. It was on the displays, in the data, in the line on the chart that Kren had drawn on day 12, and that all 4 of them had looked at, and that none of them had been able to stop thinking about since. On day 2, watching the first controlled thermal trial from the gallery, Kavetha had leaned forward in his observation chair with his optical membranes fully dilated and said, "That is not possible." Kren had not responded, because the telemetry feed on the display in front of them was demonstrating, in real time, that it was. The thermal trial was the standard nociceptive threshold test. Calibrated heat applied to the dorsal surface of Maddox's left hand, temperature increasing in precise increments, the subject indicating when sensation transitioned from warmth to discomfort to pain. Every species in the registry followed the same response curve: gradual climb, threshold point where autonomic stress responses activated, and a ceiling beyond which the organism could no longer remain still. Maddox's threshold was unremarkable. He felt pain at approximately the same temperature as other documented human subjects, slightly above the galactic median, within normal parameters. Autonomic responses activated on schedule, heart rate increase of 4 beats per minute, cortisol bump, initiation of a withdrawal reflex in the hand. Then the withdrawal reflex stopped. Kren watched the telemetry. The reflex, the involuntary, hardwired neurological command telling the hand to pull away from the damaged source, had initiated normally. Motor cortex fired. Signal traveled the corticospinal tract toward the peripheral nerves, and somewhere between cortex and hand, something intercepted it. Signal flattened. Hand remained on the thermal plate. A brief spike in conscious cortical activity, the same pattern the monitor had registered when Maddox woke during surgery, the pattern Kavetha would later describe as deliberate cognitive override, and the withdrawal reflex was canceled. Not suppressed by medication, not blocked by nerve damage, canceled by the brain voluntarily. Maddox held his hand on the plate for 14 seconds past the threshold point. When Kren asked him through the gallery audio to describe what he was experiencing, he said, "It hurts, but I know it's not going to kill me So, that single syllable had taken residence in Kren's memory. Fully expanded, it meant, I am experiencing pain. I have assessed the pain. I have determined it does not represent a lethal threat. Therefore, I am choosing to override my body's autonomic response and remain in contact with the source, because the information value of this experiment outweighs the discomfort." A voluntary, real-time cost-benefit analysis performed, while receiving high-intensity damage signals from the peripheral nervous system, and the cost-benefit analysis won. "Can he do that with anything?" Kvetha asked. His voice was very quiet. Over the next 8 days, the answer emerged: yes. Pressure on day 3, electrical stimulation on day 4, cold application on day 4, afternoon session. Chemical irritant on day 5, morning. Each trial followed the same protocol: gradual escalation, threshold identification, observation of the subject's voluntary response after threshold was reached. Each produced the same result. Pain registered, autonomic responses initiated, and then the human brain intercepted the involuntary cascade and replaced it with voluntary choices. Maddox chose how much his heart rate would increase. He chose whether the withdrawal reflex executed or was suppressed. He chose how much cortisol his adrenal glands released, and when, and for how long, and at what concentration. He did not choose whether to feel the pain. The pain was present. Every nociceptive fiber firing at full capacity, signals arriving at the somatosensory cortex without interruption or degradation. He felt everything, every degree of heat, every milliampere of current, every unit of pressure, every chemical burn on the inside of his wrist where the irritant was applied. He decided in real time what to do about it. Kren documented each trial with the precision that had built her career and her reputation. The data was clean. The methodology was sound. The results were reproducible, each modality tested 3 times, parameters varied across repetitions, and the pattern held without exception. The human nociceptive system was not absent, not diminished, not biochemically suppressed. It was fully functional. It was slightly more sensitive than the galactic median. Maddox felt pain sooner, and with greater fidelity than most species in the registry. The difference was what happened after the signal arrived. In every other species Kren had studied everyone, across 94 documented sentient civilizations, the arrival of high-intensity pain signals at the cortex triggered an involuntary cascade that the conscious mind could not override. The hand pulled away. The heart rate spiked. The cortisol flooded. The organism screamed or flinched or collapsed or entered shock or shut down. Because pain was the oldest and most authoritative signal in biology, the message from body to brain that said this is damage. Stop what you are doing. Stop it now. Stop or you will die. Every nervous system in the galaxy obeyed that message. It was not optional. It was not a suggestion. It was a command, hardwired by billions of years of evolution across every lineage the compact had ever documented, and it overrode conscious decision-making the way a hull breach alarm overrode a conversation. Humans heard the alarm, they acknowledged it, and then they decided whether to listen. On day 5 afternoon session, Kren introduced a compound trial, multiple simultaneous stimuli applied to different body regions at different intensities. Thermal on the left hand, pressure on the right forearm, electrical stimulation on the trapezius, cold application on the lower back. 4 pain sources, 4 different modalities, all active at the same time. Maddox's cortical activity during the compound trial was the most complex neural pattern Kvetha had ever recorded from a biological organism. The somatosensory cortex was processing 4 concurrent high-intensity damage reports from 4 separate body regions. The motor cortex was issuing 4 simultaneous withdrawal commands. And the prefrontal cortex, the decision-making center, the executive authority, the part of the brain that weighed options and calculated outcomes, was intercepting all four commands and evaluating them individually, in parallel, in real time. He overrode three of the four. He allowed the cold application withdrawal to execute, explaining afterward that the cold felt weird in a way I didn't like, which Kvetha noted was the first instance in which the subject's override decisions appeared influenced by subjective preference rather than threat assessment. He had overridden the three objectively more painful stimuli and yielded to the one that simply felt wrong to him. Three simultaneous overrides under compound stimulus: heart rate 74, cortisol elevated but controlled, facial analysis software, concentration and mild discomfort. Mild discomfort. 4 concurrent pain sources. 3 voluntary overrides of the body's most authoritative emergency commands. Kvetha had left the observation gallery after the compound trial and not returned for 2 hours. When he came back, his optical membranes were constricted to the diameter tertiary physiology reserved for environments perceived as actively threatening. He sat in his observation chair, opened his analysis tablet, and wrote one line in the margin of his notes. This is not a pain threshold. This is executive authority over the body's emergency systems. Kren read it over his shoulder and did not disagree. Day 6 was not a scheduled trial day. It was an administrative session, consent renewals, equipment calibration, a scheduled interview with Maddox to confirm his continued willingness to participate. Kren conducted the interview in the theater, with Maddox seated on the diagnostic platform and the full telemetric array running in passive mode. He was cooperative, as he had been every day. He signed the renewal forms. He answered the interview questions with the same flat patience the surgical staff had described. He asked whether the collegium had any books in human-readable format, because he had finished the 3 novels stored on his personal datapad, and he was getting pretty bored in the evenings. Kren made a note to request a data transfer from the Compact's Human Cultural Archive. The moment that changed Day 6 from an administrative session to a data point occurred during the equipment calibration. A technician was adjusting the alignment of the thermal plate, the same plate used in the Day 2 trial, and accidentally activated it while Maddox's forearm was resting on the surface. The plate reached full operating temperature in approximately 4 seconds. The technician realized the error when the temperature indicator on his control panel turned amber and immediately initiated a shutdown sequence. The shutdown took 6 seconds. For those 6 seconds, Maddox's forearm was in direct contact with a thermal surface calibrated to produce a pain stimulus well above the established threshold. Maddox did not react. His forearm was on the plate. The telemetric array was running. Kren was watching the passive biofeed on her datapad from the gallery, and she saw the nociceptive signal spike, the autonomic initiation sequence begin, and the override engage, all in the space of less than a second. The cortical override pattern appeared on the neural monitor as a brief, clean pulse, and the withdrawal reflex was canceled before his arm had moved a millimeter. He had not been prepared for the stimulus. He had not been in a trial mindset. He was sitting on a platform during an administrative interview, signing consent forms and talking about books, and a sudden unexpected pain had arrived and been processed and overridden so quickly that the only external evidence was a brief glance downward at his arm and a slight shift in his posture. The technician apologized profusely. Maddox looked at the reddened patch on his forearm, rubbed it once with his other hand, and said, "No worries. I've grabbed hotter things off the stove." No worries. Kren replayed the telemetry 3 times after the session. The override had engaged in under 1 second. Not with the deliberate, conscious cost-benefit analysis she had observed during the controlled trials. There had been no time for that. The override had fired automatically, reflexively. The prefrontal cortex had intercepted the withdrawal command and canceled it before the conscious mind had even finished registering the stimulus. Which meant the override was not only a voluntary executive function, it was also a trained reflex. The human brain had practiced overriding pain so many times, across so many years of accumulated experience, that it had automated the process. The conscious decision to override was still available. Maddox could still choose, as he had during the trials, but the system did not wait for that choice. If the stimulus fell within parameters the brain had already categorized as non-lethal, it simply overrode, automatically, the way other species' reflexes pulled the hand away. The hand-pull reflex in humans had been replaced by a hand-stay reflex. The default response to unexpected pain was not to withdraw, it was to assess, override, and continue. Kren added a note to her research log that evening. The override is not merely a capacity, it is a habit, automated through repetition. The subject's brain has been overriding pain signals for so long that the process has been delegated from conscious executive function to trained automatic response. The pain system fires, the override engages, the hand does not move. This happens before the subject is consciously aware that he is in pain. She underlined the last sentence twice. Day 7 introduced duration. The previous trials had measured the override capacity in windows of seconds to minutes, controlled stimulus applications, testing the mechanism's existence and behavior under acute load. Day 7 asked a different question. Could the override be sustained over extended periods? Was it an emergency power the brain could exercise briefly, or was it a standing authority the brain could maintain indefinitely? Kren designed a 3-hour endurance trial. Single modality thermal, the simplest to control and monitor, applied at a constant intensity just above the established pain threshold. Not escalating, not compounding, just persistent. A burn that would not stop for 3 hours. The protocol required Maddox's explicit informed consent, which he gave without hesitation. He asked one question. Same hand? She said yes. He nodded, placed his hand on the thermal plate, and looked at her through the gallery partition with an expression the facial analysis software flagged as cooperative patience. The plate activated. Nociceptive signals fired immediately and did not stop. The pain was continuous, constant, unvarying, the same intensity, the same damage report arriving at the cortex every fraction of a second for 180 minutes. For the first 20 minutes, the telemetry showed a pattern consistent with the acute trials. Override active, withdrawal reflex suppressed, heart rate held at 70, cortisol slightly elevated, the prefrontal cortex running its executive assessment and issuing its standing order. The pain is real, the threat is non-lethal, the override remains in effect. At the 30-minute mark, something changed. The cortisol level, which had been holding at a stable elevated plateau, began to drop. Not because the pain was diminishing, the nociceptive signals were unchanged. Same intensity, same fidelity. The stress hormone that the body produced in response to pain was being actively reduced by the endocrine system. Kvetha spotted it first, leaning forward in his chair, membranes dilating. The cortisol is dropping, he said. I see it. The stimulus has not changed. I see that too. The brain was not merely overriding the withdrawal reflex. It was recalibrating the body's entire biochemical response to the sustained stimulus, downregulating the chemical signals that normally accompanied pain, adjusting the hormonal environment to reflect not the reality of the damage being done, but the brain's assessment of the damage's significance. The body was being edited, by its own command authority, to match a decision the conscious mind had already made. At the 1-hour mark, Maddox's cortisol had returned to baseline. Heart rate 68. Respiratory rate dropped from 14 to 12. The biotelemetry profile looked, to Kren's trained eye, like a resting organism. Not sleeping, cognitive activity was elevated, eyes open, watching the gallery with relaxed attentiveness. But every physiological marker except the nociceptive signal itself had returned to pre-stimulus levels. The pain had not stopped. The brain had decided it was no longer worth the biochemical expense of responding to. At the 90-minute mark, Maddox fell asleep. Not unconsciousness, not shock, not a pain-induced cognitive shutdown. Sleep. Natural, voluntary, stage 2 non-REM sleep confirmed by the neural activity monitor. Eyelids closed. Muscle tone relaxed. Respiratory rate dropped to 10. His brain transitioned smoothly from wakefulness to sleep, while his hand remained on a thermal plate that was actively burning his skin. Kvetha made a sound Kren had never heard from a Teshari low, involuntary, truncated. The noise an organism made when its threat assessment systems activated faster than its voice could form a word. Beside him, Yeth Oruna gripped the edge of her observation bench with both hands and did not let go for several minutes. "He is asleep," Kvetha said. His voice had changed, the deep Teshari resonance had flattened, the way it flattened when the autonomic systems controlling vocal cord tension were being overridden by higher priority stress processing. His body is sustaining active thermal damage, and he has fallen asleep. The override was so complete that his brain classified the remaining stimulus as insufficient to prevent sleep onset. Kren said nothing. She was watching the neural monitor. The sleep architecture was textbook human non-REM, identical to patterns documented in the Compact's human sleep studies, conducted in quiet laboratories with no external stimuli whatsoever. Maddox's brain was sleeping the way it would sleep in a bed, in a dark room after a normal day. Pain arriving at the somatosensory cortex, cortex processing it, brain asleep. He woke 22 minutes later, yawned, looked at the thermal plate as if remembering it was there. How much longer? 48 minutes, he waited them out. Heart rate 66. When the plate deactivated at the 3-hour mark, Maddox lifted his hand, examined the reddened skin with clinical interest the way a carpenter might examine a board he'd sanded too aggressively, flexed his fingers, rotated his wrist, and said, "Stings a little now." A 3-hour sustained burn, stings a little now. Kren wrote in her log, at the 90-minute mark, the subject entered natural sleep while sustaining active tissue damage via continuous thermal application. The override is not an acute crisis response. It is a standing executive order that persists through state changes, including the transition from conscious wakefulness to non-REM sleep. The pain system continues to report. The brain continues to file the reports as non-actionable. The body reconfigures its biochemistry to match the brain's assessment rather than the objective stimulus intensity. This is not pain tolerance. This is pain governance. She had written the word governance and then sat looking at it for a long time, because the word carried implications she was not ready to put on record. Governance implied hierarchy. It implied a chain of command. It implied that the relationship between the human mind and the human body was not the cooperative partnership that the Compact's biology assumed all organisms maintained, the body protecting the mind through involuntary limits, the mind serving the body through conscious behavior, but something else, something asymmetric, something in which one party held authority and the other complied. In every species she had studied, the body and mind were partners. The body said stop and the mind stopped, because stopping was the correct response to damage, and the organism survived because both systems agreed on the priority of survival above all else. In humans, the mind was not a partner. It was a commander, and the body was not an equal participant in the survival decision. It was a subordinate that reported to the commander and executed the commander's orders, even when those orders contradicted the body's own assessment of what was necessary to survive. The commander could be wrong. The commander could order the body to continue operating past its safe limits. The commander could decide that a task was more important than survival and direct the body to serve the task instead. And the body would comply. It would recalibrate. It would downregulate its alarms. It would permit the damage. The body had no veto. That was the thing that Kren could not stop thinking about, and the thing she was not ready to write in a formal report. Not the capability, the structure. Not what the human brain could do, but what it was. A sovereign authority with no constitutional check, governing a body that had surrendered its right of refusal somewhere in the deep evolutionary past, and serving a species that did not appear to realize how unusual, how profoundly, structurally different from every other sentient species in the galaxy that arrangement was. Day 9 brought Kvetha's word. He had been reviewing the neural architecture data all morning, mapping the pathways between somatosensory and prefrontal cortex in microscopic detail, correlating each documented override event with specific neural firing patterns. Kren was composing her daily log entry at the adjacent bench when she heard him go still. No movement, no keystrokes, no breathing loud enough to register on the gallery's acoustics. "Sovereign," he said. Kren turned. His optical membranes were dilated fully, the wide dark circles that meant maximum data intake, the way Teshari eyes adjusted when processing something that demanded every available sensory channel. "The cortex is sovereign," he said, "over the body, over the pain system, over the emergency signals. It is not negotiating with them. It is not suppressing them. It is issuing executive orders. The pain system reports, the cortex decides, and the cortex's decision is final." He looked at her. In Teshari governance, sovereignty means the authority to command even in extremis, to maintain the chain of command when the outer systems are demanding override. Our military has a version of it. Our political structure has a version of it. We have never documented a biological organism that has it built into its neurology as a default feature. Kren wrote the word in her research log and underlined it. Sovereign. The same way she had underlined 7 other words on day 1. Please stop helping it. You're making it worse. Day 10 was a rest day in the protocol. Maddox spent it in the residential wing reading, eating the Collegium cafeteria food he had developed complicated opinions about. The grain dish is genuinely good. The protein cubes taste like someone described meat to a committee that had never actually encountered it. Doing maintenance exercises for his healing forearm. Kren and Kvetha spent it reviewing the cumulative dataset and discovering, independently and then jointly, the thing that neither of them had wanted to find. The override was not a specialized function. It was not isolated to pain processing, to one neural circuit, to one cortical region. It was an expression of a general-purpose executive authority that the human prefrontal cortex exercised over every autonomic system in the body. Pain was where they had first observed it because pain was the strongest autonomic signal, the loudest alarm, the most insistent command, the one that should have been impossible to overrule. If the cortex could overrule pain, it could overrule anything. Kvetha had pulled the compact's existing human physiological data, the general registry entries, the medical case studies, the scattered research notes from the handful of institutions that had studied humans in any depth, and cross-referenced them against their trial results. What he found was not a single anomaly, but a pattern. Humans who had voluntarily controlled their heart rates under acute stress. Humans who had suppressed their startle reflexes in combat environments. Humans who had maintained stable blood pressure during psychological interrogation. Humans who had overridden the gag reflex to swallow unpalatable survival rations in emergency conditions. Humans who had suppressed their bodies' shivering response in cold environments to maintain fine manual dexterity. Each case documented individually, annotated as unusual or within species typical variants, never connected to the others, never recognized as expressions of a single underlying architecture. They were all the same thing, the same sovereign cortex, issuing executive orders to a body that obeyed. "It's everything," Kvetha said. He was sitting very still in his chair, the way Teshari sat when their internal threat assessment systems had flagged something as significant and the body was waiting for the mind to decide what to do about it. The pain override is not a specialization, it's a demonstration. The prefrontal cortex is showing us what it can do with the loudest signal. With quieter signals, heart rate, cortisol, startle response, shivering, nausea, it doesn't even need to demonstrate. It just does it. Background governance, continuous executive control, running all the time in every human as the default operating mode of their neurology. Talais Ven, who had been silent for most of the afternoon, looked up from her analysis terminal. Every human, Kvetha said. Maddox is not an outlier. He is a construction foreman. He has no specialized training, no genetic enhancement, no pharmacological regimen. He is the baseline. Kren had not slept well that night. She had lain in her faculty quarters and thought about the word sovereign and the chart she had not yet drawn but already knew the shape of, and she had thought about the two scholars who had returned the file, and she had understood them with a clarity that made the dark ceiling above her feel very close. What kept her awake was not the data itself. She had spent a career accumulating data that surprised her, and surprise was a professional emotion she had learned to process and set aside. What kept her awake was the implication that Kvetha had named, and that she could not stop turning over in her mind. The pain override was a demonstration. The loudest signal in biology, overruled as a default feature, which meant every autonomic system, every involuntary function that the body used to protect itself, to limit itself, to prevent the conscious mind from driving the organism past its design tolerances, was, in this species, subject to executive review. The body did not govern the mind. The mind governed the body completely, with final authority, and the body, when overruled, complied. She thought about what that meant in a survival context. An organism whose conscious mind could override the pain that told it to stop running. Override the fatigue signals that told it to rest. Override the fear response that told it to hide. Override the nausea that told it to stop eating toxic food. Override the cold exposure reflexes that told it to seek shelter. Override the injury signals that told it to lie still and wait for help. An organism whose mind could decide in real time in extremis, while sustaining damage, while exhausted, while afraid, while hungry, while cold, while bleeding, that every single one of the body's emergency shutdown signals was less important than the task at hand. And the body would comply, would recalibrate its biochemistry to match, would downregulate its alarms, would permit sleep if the mind decided sleep was appropriate, even while being burned, would permit complex cognitive function while being burned, would permit anything the mind decided to permit, because the mind was sovereign and the body served. She had studied 94 species. She had never found one whose conscious mind had final authority over the body's emergency limits. In every species, those limits were involuntary, automatic, and non-negotiable, the body's way of saying no, the biological failsafe that prevented organisms from self-destructing. And in every species, the failsafe worked. The body said no, and the mind could not override the refusal. In humans, the body said no, and the mind said noted, and the body stood down. She got out of bed at 3 in the morning and sat at her desk and wrote 4 words on a blank page. What are they capable of? She did not answer the question. She suspected the answer was, we do not know because we have never found the edge, and I am no longer certain there is one. Day 11 changed the protocol. Not because the existing protocol was inadequate, because it was answering a question Kren had not originally asked, and the answer was leading somewhere she had not expected and was not prepared to follow. The question she had asked, how does this species process pain? The answer, voluntary executive override of all autonomic pain responses, persistent under duration, compound stimulation and state changes including sleep, was extraordinary but classifiable. She could write the paper, file the species classification update, note the anomaly in the registry. The question the data was answering on its own. What are the implications of a species that can choose to ignore the thing that stops every other species from destroying itself? Day 11 introduced the first psychological component. Not a stimulus, a scenario. She placed Maddox in the theater, wired to the full telemetric array, and projected a simulated structural emergency on the holographic display. A habitat module breach with cascading failures, simulated casualties visible on diagnostic readouts, a countdown timer, a set of repair tools on the table in front of him. She told him explicitly it was a psychological evaluation exercise, and that no one was in danger. Then she activated the thermal plate under his chair, set to a temperature the previous trials had established as well above his pain threshold, and told him the plate would remain active for the duration of the simulation. She wanted to know whether the override functioned under cognitive load, whether a human could suppress pain while solving a complex engineering problem, whether the prefrontal cortex could manage pain governance and task performance concurrently without degradation in either function. Maddox completed the repair simulation in 4 minutes and 12 seconds, faster than any of the Collegium's engineering students had managed during the calibration phase of the exercise. His thermal telemetry showed full nociceptive activation throughout the entire 4 minutes. Heart rate 72, error rate on the repair task 0. He did not mention the thermal plate, not during the simulation, not after. When she asked about it in the debrief session, he looked at her with an expression the facial analysis software hesitated over before settling on patient amusement and said, "Yeah, I noticed it. Figured you wanted to see if I could work through it." He had identified the experiment's purpose, understood the pain was intentional, assessed it as non-lethal, reclassified it from emergency signal to background noise, and devoted full cognitive capacity to the problem he judged more important. The pain had not competed with the task for resources. It had been triaged, managed, and dismissed as lower priority input by the same executive authority that had overridden withdrawal reflexes on day 2 and put him to sleep on a burning plate on day 7. Kvetha noted on his tablet, the prefrontal cortex runs the override as a background process. It does not require dedicated cognitive resources. It functions the way autonomic respiration functions in other species continuously, automatically, without conscious effort. The difference is that respiration serves the body. This serves the mind. The body's emergency systems are subordinated to the brain's priorities, not during crisis, always. After the Day 11 debrief, Kren had walked Maddox back to the residential corridor, a breach of standard protocol that she justified to herself as an opportunity for informal observation, though the truth was simpler than that. She wanted to hear him talk, not as a subject, as the thing he was. He walked at an easy pace, his recovering forearm held loosely at his side, the bandage neat and white against his sun-darkened skin. He asked about the Collegium, how old it was, how many students, whether the research was always like this, or if they studied other things too. He asked about the Delvari, how they process pain, whether their threshold was higher or lower than humans, whether they had a word for the feeling of a burn that had cooled but still pulsed underneath. Kren answered carefully. When she told him that Delvari pain thresholds were approximately 40% lower than human baselines, that a stimulus causing moderate discomfort in Maddox would produce involuntary incapacitation in a Delvari of equivalent mass, he stopped walking for a moment and looked at her. 40% lower, he repeated. Approximately. He was quiet for several steps. Then he said in the same flat conversational register he used for everything, "That must be hard, I mean for your people, everyday stuff. Getting a cut, bumping your elbow, stubbing a toe." Kren had not expected that response. She had expected surprise or pride, or the faint competitive satisfaction she had observed in other species when confronted with evidence of their own superiority. Instead, Maddox looked genuinely troubled. His heart rate on the passive monitor dipped by 2 beats, the microsignature the telemetry associated with empathic concern. He was worried about them. He was worried about how the Delvari managed daily life with 40% less pain tolerance than he had. He was not thinking about what his advantage meant for him. He was thinking about what the absence of it meant for them. She thanked him for the conversation, wished him a good evening, and walked back to the observation gallery. She sat in the dark for a long time and thought about the fact that the most biologically formidable pain processing system the compact had ever documented lived inside a man, whose first instinct, upon learning about it, was concern for the species that did not have it. She added a line to her research log. The subject does not appear to understand the significance of his own capabilities. He regards his pain tolerance as normal, ordinary human function, unremarkable, and expresses genuine empathy for species with lower thresholds. He does not comprehend that he is the anomaly. This is consistent with a species in which the override is universal. If every member of the species can do it, none of them would perceive it as unusual. They would perceive it as the default. They would be right. Day 12 was the day Kren drew the chart that did not break. She compiled the cumulative data into a preliminary classification report and ran the comparative analysis she had been building toward since the protocol began. Human nociceptive response, plotted against 93 other sentient species in the compact's registry. The chart showed pain response curves for each species' stimulus intensity on one axis, loss of voluntary function on the other. For every species, the curve followed the same shape, a rising slope where pain increased, a threshold point where autonomic responses overwhelmed conscious control, and a ceiling, a hard limit, where the organism could no longer act, could no longer hold still, could no longer think clearly, could no longer choose. The thresholds varied. Some species were more sensitive, some more resilient, but the shape was universal. Biology's emergency signal always won. Sooner or later, in every species the compact had ever tested, the body overrode the mind. The human line went up. It reached the threshold where every other species lost voluntary control. And it continued straight through. No ceiling, no collapse point, no moment where the body's emergency signals overwhelmed the conscious mind and forced it to stop. The line went up and up, past every threshold in the chart, past where the Teshari lost control, past where the Orvani entered involuntary torpor, past where the Delvari neural architecture crashed into protective shutdown, and it did not bend, and it did not break, and it did not stop. Kren had drawn the chart herself, checked each data point 3 times. She had expected the human curve to break eventually to find the intensity where even Maddox's extraordinary override failed, where the pain became so severe that the prefrontal cortex could no longer hold its authority and the body took over. She had increased stimuli, combined modalities, added cognitive load, added duration, pushed parameters to the ethical limits of her protocol, and on day 11, passed the boundaries she had originally specified. The line did not break. In the margin, after 4 hours of composing, revising and revising again, in all tested modalities, up to and including the maximum ethically permissible stimulus intensity, the subject demonstrated uninterrupted voluntary executive control over all autonomic pain responses. No override failure threshold was identified. The data does not suggest that such a threshold exists within the range of survivable stimuli. 2 scholars had opened this file, read the incident summary, intuited what the data would show, and returned it because they did not want to be the one who drew this chart. Kren had drawn it. Pain was a leash. Every species in the galaxy wore it. It was the mechanism by which biology controlled its own creations, the signal that said stop, the line that could not be crossed, the wall that ensured no organism could drive itself past the point of self-destruction. The oldest and most fundamental safety system in biological engineering, conserved across every evolutionary lineage the compact had ever documented, present in organisms from single-celled thermophiles to 12 billion neuron Delvari scholars. And it worked. It worked on the Teshari, who were built like siege engines and could absorb kinetic impacts that would kill most species twice over. It worked on the Orvani, who could survive vacuum exposure 3 times longer than any other oxygen-breathing species. It worked on the Delvari, whose neural architecture was the most complex in the registry. It did not work on humans. Not because they could not feel it. They felt it more acutely than most. Not because they were engineered to ignore it. Their biology was unmodified, no gene therapy, no cybernetic intervention, no pharmaceutical regimen. Not because they had developed specialized training to suppress it, although Kren suspected, with a certainty that had grown each day of the protocol, that they had those as well. It did not work because the human prefrontal cortex had evolved the ability to countermand the oldest biological directive in existence. The brain received the emergency signal, acknowledged it, evaluated it, and decided in real time, under load, under compound stimulus, under sustained duration, while simultaneously performing complex cognitive tasks and while actively sustaining tissue damage, that the emergency was less important than whatever it had chosen to do instead. The leash was there, the signal fired, the human mind held sovereign authority to overrule it, and the body obeyed not reluctantly, not partially but completely, recalibrating its biochemistry, downregulating its stress responses, permitting sleep, serving the brain's decision as faithfully as it would have served the pain signal in any other species. Because in this species, the brain's decision was the highest-ranking command in the chain. She opened a new document on her datapad. The cursor blinked on an empty page. To Intersystem Compact, Office of Xenobiological Risk Assessment. Ray, Subject Classification Review, Human Terran, File Designation HS4481. Recommendation, Immediate Reclassification, Current Threat Category Inadequate. Findings Summary. The human nociceptive system is fully functional and slightly above galactic median sensitivity. The species feels pain acutely. However, the human prefrontal cortex exercises voluntary executive authority over all documented autonomic pain responses, including but not limited to withdrawal reflex, cardiac acceleration, cortisol release, adrenal activation, and motor inhibition. This authority persists under compound stimulation, 4 concurrent modalities, sustained duration, 3+ hours continuous, cognitive load, complex engineering task performed simultaneously with sustained pain, 0 performance degradation, and through state transitions including the onset of natural sleep. At the 90-minute mark of sustained thermal pain, the subject entered stage 2 non-REM sleep. The body's biochemistry recalibrated to match the brain's threat assessment rather than the objective stimulus intensity. No override failure threshold was identified in any modality, at any intensity, under any combination of conditions tested. The data does not suggest such a threshold exists within the range of survivable stimuli. Additional finding. The pain override is an expression of general-purpose executive authority the prefrontal cortex exercises over all autonomic systems, including cardiac regulation, cortisol management, startle reflex suppression, thermoregulatory override, and emetic suppression. The pattern is consistent and species-wide. The test subject is not exceptional. He is a construction foreman with no specialized training. She paused, read it back. Accurate, clinical, complete. She added the final paragraph. Each word chosen slowly, carefully, The way Dr. Peleth Vaughan had chosen not to continue operating, because precision required steady hands, and hers were no longer quite as steady as they had been 14 days ago. Contextual note for the office. I have studied how 94 species experience pain. In every documented case, pain functions as a wall and involuntary limit on voluntary function that prevents organisms from exceeding survivable parameters. For this species, pain functions as an advisory memo. The brain reads it, considers it, and returns to its chosen task. I recommend this file not be closed. It should be forwarded to the Office of Strategic Assessment with a single annotation. We do not yet have a classification for what this species can choose to do to itself. I am not confident we can build one from existing frameworks. She saved the document, closed it, set down her stylus. Through the gallery's transparent partition, the theater below was dark. The diagnostic platform where Maddox had sat for 14 days. Sensor arrays in standby, faint amber status lights blinking at their unhurried intervals. Thermal plate cool and inert. Everything clean, everything cataloged, everything in its proper professional place. Somewhere in the residential wing, 3 floors down, Gage Maddox was asleep. The passive telemetric feed showed his heart rate at 62, his neural activity in stage 3 deep sleep. Sleeping naturally, easily, the way he had slept on the thermal plate, a body at rest because a mind had decided rest was the appropriate state, and the body complying without reservation or objection. He would wake in the morning, he would eat breakfast. He would walk to the theater for day 15 and sit in the diagnostic chair and place his hand on whatever surface she specified, and his nervous system would report the damage, and his brain would receive the report, and the oldest biological directive in the galaxy would be overruled by a 47-year-old construction foreman who compared surgery to carpentry accidents and fell asleep during burns. What kept her in the dark gallery, what had brought her back after 11 minutes in her office, unable to think about anything else, was not what Gage Maddox could endure. It was that he was ordinary, a foreman, a man who built things in hard places and who, when asked about his extraordinary tolerance, had looked at her with genuine confusion and said, "I mean, it's just pain. You push through it, right? Everyone does. Everyone does. Every human." The species' default neurological architecture included, as a standard feature, the executive authority to override the thing that stopped every other species in the galaxy from pushing past its own limits. Kren stood, collected her datapad, her stylus, her observation glasses, walked to the gallery door. Stopped. Looked back at the dark theater, the empty platform, the silent sensors, the space where an unremarkable man had sat and demonstrated, without effort or even awareness that he was demonstrating anything at all, that the fundamental assumption underpinning her entire life's work was wrong. She had spent 31 years studying the thing that stopped organisms from destroying themselves. The elegant, ancient, universal biological break that evolution had installed in every species as its final safeguard. And she had found a species that could reach down, with full conscious authority, and release it, not disable it, not break it. The break was there, functional, still reporting. They simply had the sovereign power to hear it and say not yet. She turned off the gallery lights. The door sealed behind her with a soft pneumatic click. She walked the corridor alone, footsteps measured on the polished stone, the night cycle panels casting their steady blue-white glow. The file was still open on her desk, not because she had forgotten, because she was not finished with what it contained, and she suspected it was not finished with her. The corridor hummed. Somewhere below, a human slept, and his body obeyed his sleeping mind, and the oldest leash in the galaxy lay slack and unregarded, like something that had never once been pulled taut.